Now, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Defense Secretary Hagel are in Beijing this week for talks with their Chinese counterparts. As VOA Scott Stearns tells us, economic and military issues are high on the agenda.
Secretary Kerry comes to this strategic and economic dialogue facing Chinese and South Korean concerns about a more active Japanese military. Ending a 1945 ban on fighting abroad, Japanese soldiers will now work more closely with other armies in training and peacekeeping. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe says he's protecting Japanese citizens.
By
being better prepared, it is possible to deter those who look to go to war against Japan.
In Washington, U.S. State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki welcomed the move.
In order for it to be successful, it's important they move forward in a transparent manner, but we have an open dialogue with Japan about a range of issues, including our security cooperation and partnerships, and so we expect that to be the case.
But Chinese President Xi Jinping and South Korean President Park Geun-hye say a more active Japanese military could undermine regional stability. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Hong Lei.
We demand that Japan earnestly respect the reasonable security concerns of its Asian neighbors. It must not harm China's national sovereignty and security, and it must not damage regional peace.
Chinese and South Korean opposition to the move complicates U.S. policy in the region, says Yonsei University professor John Delury.
They will try to find some way to present a sort of united front against Prime Minister Abe in Japan, and of course that puts the United States in an awkward position.
Especially as China and South Korea each have territorial disputes with Japan. American Enterprise Institute analyst Michael Osland says it's an opportunity for China.
China has done everything it can to abet a split in Korean-Japanese relations, and I think the two sides, Seoul and Tokyo, are recognizing that, you know what, you may not like who your neighbor is, but you've got to live with your neighbor, especially when you've got a much more threatening neighbor.
South Korea says it will never allow Japanese forces to affect the Korean peninsula without its consent, urging Tokyo to pursue its new military posture only within the framework of its alliance with the United States. Scott Stearns, VOA News at the State Department.
Now, for more perspective, Scott Stearns joins us now from the State Department. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Vincent.
Now, how significant is this meeting by these leaders?
Well, the strategic and economic dialogue between the United States and China is obviously a cornerstone of U.S. policy in Asia and globally. Clearly, the secretaries, the foreign ministers and defense ministers are talking about the war in Syria, the ISIS, the international efforts to limit Iran's nuclear program, the fighting in Ukraine, all of really the big issues that involve the United States and China, obviously two of the 5 members of the UN Security Council.
Now, we know that these countries, these two economic powers of the world, do not see eye to eye on certain issues, including some issues of security in Africa. Now, are they likely to change positions, or they just have to compromise?
On some of the bigger security issues in Africa, I think especially about piracy off the Horn, China has played a surprisingly active role, and there's been some pretty good cooperation, I think, between the United States and China on combating piracy. It's one of the reasons that you haven't heard about so much piracy off the Somali coast. The other issue that was discussed today in Beijing regarding Africa was the issue of South Sudan, and again, there has been relatively good cooperation between the United States and China. Clearly, the situation in South Sudan is not as bad as it was, a month ago, in that you don't have outright fighting, but the hostilities between the divisions within those factions in South Sudan, the hunger situation there, China has played an active role, largely because the oil in South Sudan that needs to go out through that pipeline through Port Sudan is largely oil that's destined for China. So China has a stake in a long-term, a lasting solution to some of these broader issues between South Sudan and Sudan.
Would you say this is one area where they easily kind of converge on some of the issues there in South Sudan, as opposed to what used to be previously the conflict between North and South and the position of China and that of the U.S.?
Yes, I think that the U.S. and China, with the advent of South Sudan, are more on the same page in trying to resolve some of these, you know what they are, the long-standing border issues, the issues of identity, the issues of access to the pipeline. The Obama administration, at least so far, has been relatively pleased with China's cooperation on those issues in South Sudan.
Okay, thanks a lot, Scott, for joining us today.
Sure thing.
Well, Scott Stearns, viewers, State Department correspondent, talking to us live there. Now, we want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we covered. Join the conversation on Facebook.